We're on the floor of what is the media center here at the first gathering on African soil of members of the G20. Over the next few hours, many more of the world's media will begin to arrive, and as they arrive, each will be scrutinizing what each and every single leader has to present when they speak here over the next 2 days. It's going to focus a lot on what the world economies want, but as we know, the G20's mandate has long expanded from what it was in the 90s, when ultimately the broader economic context of the world was the focus following the crisis of 1997. Now issues like climate change, healthcare have all been factored into what needs to happen. So ultimately, while all of that is going on. In fact, we're going to go now. The president of Namibia is arriving. As I said, world leaders from all over now descending on South Africa. Let's show you those pictures of the arrival of the Namibian president. So the arrival of the Namibian president is important because, as I was saying earlier, this is the first time that the G20 is gathering on African soil. Let's take in the pictures and have a look. So the Namibian president is arriving at a crucial time, as I was saying, because when you consider what Africa wants to achieve basically out of this summit, they want to advance an African agenda. And while all of that is being done, these heads of state are hoping that the AU will be that vehicle. South Africa as host will also be expected to do much of that work. Let's bring in SABC News specialist correspondent Sophie Mokoena with us. And Sophie, you're watching the arrival of the Namibian president. Your reflections on where Namibia is politically and the gathering itself?
Well, quite an important moment. This is the first female president of Namibia, but a diplomat, a seasoned diplomat. She's a former foreign affairs minister, and therefore I think even South Africa, whatever contribution she is going to make behind closed doors, particularly when the president is hosting his African counterparts, whom he will meet on the margins of the summit, she comes with experience. Secondly, when you talk about the rare minerals, Namibia has just discovered the rare minerals, and we know that they are high on the agenda. You look at hydrogen, quite an important one. But lastly, Africa, high on the agenda. And you heard earlier on the UN chief talking about Africa taking its rightful place, particularly as it relates to the transformation of the United Nations, the Security Council, having African countries being represented there in line with Ezulwini consensus. And therefore, to have a leader from Africa coming here as part of those who have been invited by President Ramaphosa, that's the symbol that they also are here to support the agenda and the position of the developing South, South Africa. But remember also that Africa now has a seat in the forum, that is the G20, the African Union. And later in around 1930, we will see the arrival of the president of Nigeria. So you'll see more African leaders arriving who have been invited by President Ramaphosa. And the good news is that the Sherpa has been able to spearhead a successful discussions, a marathon meeting, almost 24 hours since yesterday. And finally, there's a draft declaration, but the leaders now must take a decision whether they adopt, they approve. And I think a good work done there by Ambassador, who was working with the DG, Zane Dango, and the Minister of International Relations in terms of being able to have this draft declaration.
And Sunil, do we expect a lot of actual deal-making to happen during the G20?
Thanks, Timokile. I think a lot of that is already taking place to the various groups, the finance ministers meeting, the engagements that just recently happened at the UNGA. We heard earlier on our Secretary General of the UN using the Pact of the Future as a template to give his inputs today, talking about peace, talking about a reduction of wars, talking more about climate change and the financial architecture. So the deal making, etc., will happen along the sidelines. The bilaterals, we know President Ramaphosa just conducted a few bilaterals a short while ago in Sandton. Those deals are being completed on the basis of frameworks that already exist in terms of bilateral agreements and possibly trilateral agreements when it comes to multilateral organizations like the EU and the UN and others.
I'm hoping that we're still on those pictures watching the arrival of the Namibian president. And while we do that then, Sophie, I'm going to hand over back to you and speak about how Africa will navigate a summit where there are so many vested interests from different parts of the world.
Well, I think Africa will be able to manage this. South Africa has been involved in many negotiations since 1994. This is not the first time the country has been hosting a big forum. This is smaller than the World Summit on Sustainable Development, where it was a UN conference with UN member countries. We know that UN has got more than 100 member states. Secondly, the racism conference in Durban, which was nearly derailed by the United States of America and Israel, because it was about addressing the injustices as it relates to race, gender, and equality. And therefore, the two countries were not happy about this and the draft. But at that time, the leadership of South Africa was able to ensure that majority of the countries do agree. So it's not the first time. And I think the other issue is you have seasoned South Africans who have been part of diplomacy and global engagements, who are behind the scenes engaging with the current leadership to make input to ensure that the forum this time around, now at the heads of state level, because this is the second time, the first time it was Minister Manuel addressing or hosting when it was at ministerial level, is a success. So the fact that our sources are telling us that there's a draft declaration, it speaks to South Africa's capability when it comes to negotiations. But also Africa is here to support.
And you're a woman who is well-versed with the machinations often of what goes into the discussions to formulate a declaration. Are we getting an early indication of what is likely to be in that declaration when you consider that, yes, the G20 countries get along, but they're not necessarily, for example, singing from the same hymn book on issues of the climate, how to fund healthcare, etc. You mentioned Israel. The situation, what's happening in Gaza, South Africa's ICC case has in fact put this country at odds with some of the other G20 nations over the last few months.
I think it will capture the theme of the summit as per South Africa's position: sustainability, equality, and solidarity. And you had the UN chief talking about those issues. His message tomorrow is going to emphasize the fact that G20, particularly the developed North, don't just talk, implement the reforms of the financial institution or system, IMF and the World Bank. And it will capture that. When I spoke to Minister of Finance, he indicated that the issue of the debt was discussed within the finance track. And therefore, I expect that to come up. The issue of peace and security, as the UN chief has indicated, the problems in Ukraine, Middle East, Gaza, Sudan, he went to town. And why did the SG chose to emphasize Sudan? He is on the African continent. He has to speak to issues here on the African continent. And therefore also the issue of the DRC. So the peace and security will be there, global trade will be there, and sustainability, the UN goals, emphasizing a need to reach those targets.
I want to talk to you about what some of the stuff that the SG has said in his interview with our Sherwin Bryce-Pease, speaking exclusively a short time ago. But before we get there, Sunil, on South Africa specifically, and perhaps the continent more broadly, in terms of opportunity and leveraging this moment, how do the leaders, President Cyril Ramaphosa and the others from the AU, make sure that this has a meaningful, perhaps longer-term positive effect for the people of South Africa, our neighbors, and beyond?
There is already an engagement model which has been put in place, which talks to 5 years from this point forward. That is a critical framework around financing, the reduction of financial costs, etc. But the key thing is to trickle that down to the man on the street. That talks to being, with a reduction with financial costs, more available funds to undertake health, to undertake other basic costs which are around education, and more particularly the stimulation of the economy through infrastructure development. Then the other matter which I think is quite important for us is that during this time, President Ramaphosa in South Africa has been able to galvanize much more collegiate arrangements with the G7 in particular. The EU, we know there was a meeting recently where funding around the just transition has taken place. So already what we're seeing is that there's a plethora of opportunities that have arisen to bring in financing and capital onto the continent. That is where some of our major challenges lie. Then the other area which I believe is important is the area of artificial intelligence. South Africa is, for the first time, is a country in the global south leading the conversation on AI governance models, and has worked tirelessly to put in place some models and some recommendations which will ensure that the voices of the global south in general is taken into account. Take into account Ubuntu, take into account the cultural sensitivity of environments, and ensuring that these AI models and algorithms do not impact our people negatively.
And Sophie, I said I would ask you about some of the comments made by SG Guterres in the interview with Sherwin. And in fact, one of the things that he said was he applauded President Cyril Ramaphosa for the way in which, for want of a better word, the gentlemanly way, if you will, in which he's handled some of the drama in the road to here, some of it as recently as 24 hours ago with the United States in particular. What role then does a body like the UN play at a time when ultimately it's a grouping of nations here that's gathering under the G20? What does he do?
Well, I think the SG is here to finalize what he started last year. You would recall he came to South Africa to speak to President Ramaphosa, trying to ensure that there's synergy between the G20 and the United Nations. It was in December last year. And what he said on the podium today when he was addressing the media, and he is going to repeat that tomorrow. He said it to the SABC last year, and he is emphasizing the fact that he is here to support South Africa as a developing country, a country on the African continent, and a country that is playing an important role on the global stage. And therefore, for him, this is home. I think he's more relaxed and comfortable because he knows very well the head of state of this country will not contradict him or perhaps embarrass him in terms of contradiction in his statements. And also the South Africans. The South Africans are normally, they don't have issues with the UN. The only concern is that UN must have more teeth as the global body, but also a call for the institution or this organization or this world body to transform. As the UN chief has indicated, that has been his campaign, to see Africa taking its rightful place in the Security Council, but also the transformation of the IMF and the World Bank. And therefore, I think that is why he was talking about thanking South Africa and also the people of South Africa, because every government, you are a government because of the people. If South Africans are not, involved, don't have interest in what's happening, who do you represent? And I think that's why the SG emphasized South Africans as well. Yes, South Africans are very vibrant and we are not homogeneous. We raised sharply issues that we thought must be raised, and the South African population will continue to do that until the summit ends. But you saw how they rallied behind the flag when the flag was under siege, in the context of some people trying to derail the summit, even though we have our own issues.
And I'm not sure, I'll wait for the team to indicate if we still have those pictures of the arrival of the Namibian president. Let's perhaps, while we wait to do that, we'll show you, give you a scan shortly of what's going on here at the Nasrec Expo Center where the G20 leaders will be meeting. If you're looking at me now, I'm sweating. You're right, it's because a lot of those leaders who will be gathering are themselves going to be sweating during very intense deliberations on issues of trade, issues of politics that are going to come up. Healthcare, how do we fund healthcare? What do we do with a world where the top 1% is getting richer while you and I are simply getting poorer? So the G20 then, the leaders who will be gathered here, including representation from the European Union, the African Union, very significant this year, they will all have to chew on how they navigate those headwinds, because ultimately the populations of each and every single one of the countries want to see meaningful change. Is this the G20 summit that will be able to deliver on those promises of inclusivity, sustainability, as well as equality? Is that what's going to come out at the end of the gathering in Johannesburg this weekend? Well, stay with SABC News. We're right across every angle of the story to make sure we tell you what exactly happens at the end. And